Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be tackling American cities between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Seems like this is a pretty fascinating era for you, right? You sent over a whole bunch of notes and textbook excerpts.
Yeah, tons of stuff. It's a really interesting period, a time of massive change, really the birth of the modern American city.
It really does seem like a pivotal time. Huge population shifts, new technologies popping up everywhere, cultural clashes. I guess our mission here is to uncover some of those stories, like how American cities became these, melting pots of innovation and change.
Exactly. It was a time when the seeds of modern urban life were sown.
So where do we even start? I mean, looking at these sources, it's clear that cities were absolutely bursting at the seams with new arrivals.
Right. The sheer scale of migration during this period is pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah, so what was driving this population explosion?
Well, you've got internal migration, people moving from rural areas to these booming industrial centers. But what really makes this era stand out is the influx of immigrants.
From all over.
Yeah, both from within the U.S. and from across the globe.
My notes mention the Great Migration, a mass exodus of African Americans from the South. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. It was a monumental demographic shift. You see, African Americans were fleeing the South, trying to escape the poverty, the violence, the racial oppression. They were looking for refuge and opportunity in those industrial cities of the North and Midwest.
Like Chicago, Detroit, New York.
Exactly. Those cities saw huge influxes of African Americans. And this migration, it went on for decades, well into the 20th century. It really changed the social and cultural landscape of American cities.
Millions of people all looking for a better life.
Yeah, and it wasn't just African Americans. This period also saw a huge influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Greeks, Russians, Poles. They were all drawn to America's promise, the promise of economic opportunity, a better life.
I came across this statistic in my research. In 1890, something like 87% of Chicago's population was made up of immigrants.
Wow, that's a lot. It really shows just how diverse American cities were becoming, almost overnight. It was a truly transformative period.
But I imagine not everyone was thrilled about this influx of newcomers. My notes mention some tension between these new immigrants and the old stock Americans, the ones who'd been here for generations.
Oh, yeah, there was definitely tension. This era saw a surge in what we call xenophobia and nativism.
Fear of foreigners, basically.
Exactly. There was this fear that these newcomers, with their different cultures and religions, would somehow threaten American values and traditions.
Was there any organized opposition to this immigration?
Definitely. There were groups like the Know-Nothings who actively campaigned against immigration. They often targeted specific groups like Irish Catholics or Eastern European Jews. It got pretty ugly sometimes.
Yeah, your sources even mention churches being burned down, which is just awful.
It was a dark chapter, for sure. But it's important to remember that this tension, this debate about welcoming newcomers versus protecting established ways of life, it's a recurring theme throughout American history. Even today, we're still grappling with these issues.
Right. It's an ongoing conversation. So back then, what was the dominant approach to integrating these new immigrants?
Well, the idea at the time was the melting pot, this notion that everyone should assimilate, blend into a uniform American identity.
It makes you wonder, though, if that was even possible or even desirable.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Today, we talk more about a salad bowl model, where different cultures can coexist and retain their unique identities while still contributing to the larger society.
It's definitely a different approach. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how all of this demographic change impacted the physical landscape of these cities. My notes mention the emergence of public spaces, especially parks.
That's a great point. You have to imagine cities were becoming increasingly crowded and congested. The need for open, green spaces, a place to escape the chaos, it became really important.
Like a refuge from the city.
Exactly. And this is where the City Beautiful movement comes in.
So this movement was about?
Well, it was about creating more aesthetically pleasing and functional urban environments. Think grand boulevards, impressive public buildings, libraries, museums, things that would elevate the city's image and improve people's lives.
Central Park in New York City is a perfect example of this, right?
Absolutely. Central Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, was meant to be this grand oasis in the middle of the city, a place where people from all walks of life could escape the noise and congestion, connect with nature, enjoy some recreational activities.
It's hard to imagine New York without Central Park now.
It's become such an iconic landmark. But the City Beautiful movement, it wasn't just about parks, it was about creating a sense of civic pride and beauty amidst the often chaotic reality of urban life.
So on the one hand, you have these grand public spaces being created. But on the other hand, your sources paint a very different picture of life for many immigrants. They talk about these things called tenement housing, which sound absolutely awful.
Yeah, the contrast is pretty stark. While the wealthy elite were building their lavish mansions in exclusive neighborhoods, the vast majority of immigrants were crammed into these overcrowded, often unsanitary tenements.
What were they like, these tenements?
Basically, they were multi-story buildings, often poorly maintained. You would have entire families living in a single, cramped room.
It's hard to imagine living in such conditions.
It was a really difficult situation, and there was a photographer and journalist, Jacob Riis, who really exposed the horrific reality of tenement life in his book, How the Other Half Lives.
Did his book have any impact?
Absolutely. Riis's work was groundbreaking. His photographs and writings, they shocked the nation. He brought the plight of the urban poor into the public consciousness.
I imagine his work played a role in prompting social reform.
Oh, absolutely. Riis's work galvanized public support for housing reform, things like improvements in sanitation, building codes, social services. It was a turning point.
So we see this tension emerging, right, between progress and inequality.
Yeah, it's a constant theme during this period. It was a time of immense opportunity, but also of immense challenges. And that tension, that struggle for a more just and equitable society is really at the heart of the urban experience during this period.
Makes you wonder how people coped with all this change and upheaval.
Well, that's where we get into the fascinating world of technology and innovation, which we'll discuss in our next section.
Sounds good. I'm excited to dive into that.
Can you imagine trying to navigate those crowded streets with, mostly horse-drawn carriages?
Oh, it would be chaos.
Total chaos. The streets were jammed, sanitation was a nightmare, and disease spread like crazy.
Yikes. So it was clear that something had to change, right?
Oh, absolutely. And thankfully it did. A whole wave of new technologies emerge that would totally revolutionize urban life.
Okay, so let's talk about these game-changing technologies. I'm thinking cable cars, elevated railways, electric trolleys. It's mind-blowing how quickly these innovations were adopted.
It really is. Cities were desperate for solutions, and inventors and engineers, they were really stepping up.
Right.
Take Richmond, Virginia, for example. They had electric trolleys up and running as early as 1888.
1888. That's incredible. And then, of course, we have the subways, those engineering marvels that really redefined urban transportation.
I know, right? The first subway system in the U.S. opened in Boston in 1897.
Oh, wow.
And then just a few years later, in 1904, New York City's IRT began operation.
It's amazing to think about the impact of these underground railways.
Oh, yeah. They allowed people to move so much faster across these vast distances. It opened up new possibilities for work, leisure, social interaction.
I read this funny thing in the New York Times back then. Some subway riders were already complaining about, people watching being tiresome.
Oh, come on.
Right. Some things never change.
Human nature is a constant, for sure. But yeah, these new transportation systems allowed cities to just sprawl outwards in ways they never could before, and that's where steel comes into play.
Ah, steel.
Yeah.
The backbone of the modern cities.
Totally. Before steel, buildings were limited in height by the strength of, traditional materials like brick and stone.
Right.
But steel, oh man, steel allowed for much taller, stronger, more daring structures.
Like the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah. Completed in 1883, connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn.
A true symbol of the ambition and progress of the age.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, we can't forget about skyscrapers.
The first skyscraper, the home insurance building in Chicago,
Built in 1885.
it was only 10 stories tall.
Only 10 stories. I mean, I know that doesn't sound impressive today.
Right.
But back then, it was revolutionary.
It was. It was a symbol of what was possible with steel frame construction and the electric elevator.
Right.
These innovations allowed architects to, really reach for the sky.
I bet people were just awestruck seeing these steel giants rising above the cityscape.
I'm sure they were. It was a time of, incredible optimism and this belief that technology could solve any problem.
Yeah, but of course, every rose has its thorn.
Right. Progress comes with challenges. The rapid growth of cities also brought a darker side, poverty, crime.
Yeah, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. This era of innovation also had its downsides.
Right, like the huge influx of people, many of them immigrants. They led to overcrowding, inadequate housing, sanitation problems. These conditions, they created a breeding ground for crime, violence, and disease.
It's heartbreaking to even think about those conditions. Like, what were some of the specific challenges that came out of this?
Well, just imagine living in a tenement building with like multiple families,
Oh my God.
crammed into a single apartment, often without running water or proper ventilation.
Oh, it's awful.
Disease just spread so rapidly, infant mortality rates were through the roof, and life expectancy was way lower compared to rural areas.
And you mentioned crime. Like,
Uh-huh.
what was the nature of crime back then in these, these booming cities?
It was a complex issue, often fueled by poverty, desperation, and just, social unrest. Like you had petty theft, of course, but also more organized gangs like those in New York's Five Points,
Oh, yeah.
where Irish immigrants clashed with nativist groups. It was a real melting pot of cultures, but also, a cauldron of conflict.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that even in times of great progress, some people get left behind.
Absolutely.
So what about law enforcement? Were they able to even maintain order in these chaotic environments?
Well, law enforcement itself was still evolving during this period. In New York City, you actually had two competing police forces. Yeah, the Metropolitan Police and the Municipal Police. Often they were more focused on, battling each other than public safety.
Oh, wow.
So imagine trying to enforce the law in such a, fragmented and politically charged environment.
It sounds like a recipe for, corruption and abuse of power.
Yeah, it's tough.
It makes you wonder how regular people even navigated all of this,
It must have taken a lot of resilience.
Right,
But it's important to remember that there were people and organizations trying to make a difference.
right.
The Salvation Army, established in 1879, they were working to address poverty and social ills, but often their approach focused more on religious revivalism than direct aid.
Right, so it was a mixed bag, but at least people were trying.
Definitely. And speaking of power structures, this era also saw the rise of political machines and just, rampant corruption.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dark side to the story.
Right,
Like
yeah.
the booming economy, the influence of these powerful corporations.
Mm.
It really raised questions about the state of democracy in American cities.
It did, for sure.
So let's break this down a bit. What exactly were these political machines?
Well, in essence, they were organizations that traded favors for votes. They'd offered jobs, contracts, even political positions.
Oh,
And they often exploited immigrants who were, really eager to establish themselves in their new home.
yeah, they were vulnerable.
Right. Think of it as kind of a shadow government
Right.
wielding power behind the scenes.
And the most infamous example of this was, of course, Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall machine in New York City.
Exactly. Tweed and his cronies, they were masters at manipulating the system. They skimmed millions of dollars from government contracts, through bribes and kickbacks.
Wow, that's bold.
Right. But it's also important to acknowledge that despite all the corruption, these machines did provide some essential services.
Really?
Yeah. They helped immigrants find housing, jobs, and even navigate the legal system.
Huh. So it's like this double-edged sword. They were helping, but at a cost.
Exactly. It makes you think about how even today, money and influence still play such a big role in our political systems.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to always be vigilant,
For sure.
hold our leaders accountable.
Right.
But let's shift gears a bit, because while all of this was happening, another fascinating cultural shift was underway: the rise of mass consumption.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think how much our shopping habits have changed. Like, department stores were just becoming popular back then, and catalogs.
Oh, yeah, the catalogs.
Yeah, it was like a whole new world opening up to the average person,
Right. Wages were rising, more disposable income.
especially for that growing middle class, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Managers, clerks, those in the professional trades saw their salaries jump something like 30% between 1890 and 1910.
Wow, that's a big jump. What about the working class? Did they see similar gains?
Working class wages did increase, but not as much, and women, Black Americans, and immigrants still earned significantly less.
Yeah, not so surprising, unfortunately. But more people did have money to spend, And that meant new consumer goods,
Oh, absolutely. Ready-made clothing was a big one,
especially for women, right?
especially for women. Before, most clothing was made at home, but now you could just walk into a department store and bam, stylish and affordable.
I bet those early catalogs were fascinating.
Oh, I
I could just imagine women like circling the items they wanted.
It was like the early days of online shopping, right?
Exactly.
Another huge innovation was the mass production of tin cans.
Oh, yeah, the 1880s.
Right, and that led to a boom in canned food.
All those staples like canned tomatoes, fruits, vegetables.
Exactly. And let's not forget condensed milk, a revolution in food preservation and for infant nutrition.
And it wasn't just non-perishables, right? You had refrigerated rail cars.
That's right. Perishable foods could be transported long distances without spoiling.
It's mind-blowing to think about life before refrigerators.
I know, you'd be relying on ice boxes.
Right. And forget about fresh produce out of season.
It really is remarkable how much we take those innovations for granted.
For sure. Refrigeration changed our diets, improved public health.
Absolutely. Access to fresh food year-round led to better health and increased life expectancy. In fact, life expectancy rose by 6 years between 1900 and 1920.
Wow. It really shows how these advancements can have a ripple effect, right? It's not just convenience, it's well-being.
Exactly. And speaking of well-being, this era also saw the emergence of a new concept for the working class: leisure.
Leisure. That sounds almost revolutionary for the time.
I know, right? Before this, leisure was mostly for the wealthy, but now with rising wages and shorter work hours, working people had more time and money to enjoy things outside of work.
That's a huge shift.
And it even reached intellectual circles. Economist Simon Patten, in his 1902 book, The Theory of Prosperity, argued that scarcity of resources was no longer the main concern in modern societies.
Interesting.
He believed that spending, rather than saving, was actually beneficial for the economy.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea for back then, to encourage spending.
It was. It makes you wonder how much his ideas influence the consumerist society we live in now.
Right. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
How were people spending their leisure time? What were some of the popular forms of entertainment?
Well, mass entertainment really took off, especially in cities. Vaudeville, for example, was incredibly popular.
Those variety shows with all the different acts, right?
Exactly. Singers, dancers, comedians, magicians, you name it. It was entertainment for everyone.
Sounds a lot like the talent shows we have today.
Does, doesn't it? But while vaudeville did offer opportunities for Black performers, they were often given demeaning roles.
Yeah, it's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
That's for sure.
Let's talk about amusement parks.
Oh, yes. Amusement parks, like Coney Island,
Coney Island in Brooklyn.
opened in 1903. People flock there for the roller coasters, the Ferris wheels, sideshows, all sorts of exciting attractions.
Coney Island is still an icon today.
It is.
What was it like back then, in its heyday?
Oh, just imagine the roar of the roller coaster, the laughter of children, the smell of popcorn and hot dogs. It was a sensory overload.
Sounds amazing.
And it was a place where social classes mixed, where immigrants could experience American culture and just escape from everyday worries.
A true escape.
It was. And speaking of iconic American pastimes, we can't forget about baseball.
Ah, baseball. The national pastime.
By the 1850s, it had really caught on, and by the 1870s, most cities had their own teams.
It really captured the imagination of the nation.
It did, but it was also a reflection of the social divisions of the time.
In what way?
Well, there were Black players in the early days of professional baseball, like Moses Fleetwood Walker. He became the first Black player signed to a major league team in 1884.
Wow. I didn't know that.
But just a few years later, in 1887, Black players were banned from the professional leagues.
Oh, wow. That's a huge step backwards.
It was. It highlights the ongoing struggle for racial equality.
It's a complex story, isn't it?
It is, full of triumph and tragedy, just like American society at the time. While all that social and technological stuff is going on that we just talked about, the medical world was going through its own revolution.
Yeah, it's easy to get focused on one thing and forget how interconnected everything was back then. Like my notes here mentioned germ theory finally becoming widely accepted around this time.
Yeah, huge turning point. It's hard to believe now, but for centuries, people had all sorts of weird ideas about what caused diseases.
Right.
Oh, bad air, imbalances in the body, you name it. But finally, thanks to guys like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, people started understanding that microscopic organisms, germs, were the real culprits behind a lot of illnesses.
It must have changed everything for doctors, right? How they approach treatment and prevention.
Totally. Imagine that shift in thinking, right? Suddenly, it's not about chasing away bad smells or balancing humors. It's about targeting these tiny, invisible enemies.
And it seems like that shift happened alongside some incredible technological advancements. I'm thinking about X-rays, which let doctors see inside the human body without surgery.
Oh, yeah, X-rays were groundbreaking. I mean, being able to actually see inside the body, it must have seemed like science fiction at the time. And then you've got the microscope, which meant scientists could actually study these little pathogens up close.
That must have really solidified the germ theory.
Absolutely. And it led to a wave of new medical interventions and preventative measures. I mean, think about it, aspirin, something we all have in our medicine cabinet today, was first synthesized in 1899.
Wow, never thought about that.
And blood transfusions, though still risky back then, became more viable around 1906 because we started understanding blood types and sterilization better. So much progress in just a few years.
It sounds like the medical world was exploding with discoveries. Did all these advancements improve public health?
Oh, they did. Big time. Mortality rates, especially for infectious diseases, started to go down.
That's good news.
It is, but we can't pretend everything was perfect. Access to healthcare was still very uneven. Poor people, immigrants, and people of color often had a much higher risk of getting sick and dying.
Because of limited resources.
Yeah, and ongoing discrimination, unfortunately. It's like we've been seeing throughout this whole deep dive. Amazing progress in technology and knowledge, but those benefits weren't shared equally by everyone.
A recurring theme, for sure. It's good that your sources also highlight areas where people were fighting for more equality, like the expanding opportunities for women in education, right?
Absolutely. This was a time when higher education became more accessible to women.
So women were finally allowed in colleges.
Yeah, some institutions, like land-grant colleges, which were established through the Morrill Act of 1862, started opening their doors to women. And even some private institutions, like Cornell and Wesleyan, started admitting women alongside men.
That's a big deal. Yeah. Were there any schools specifically created for women?
Oh, yeah. In the late 19th century, a bunch of prestigious women's colleges were founded. Vassar, Wellesley, Smith, Bryn Mawr, just to name a few.
I've heard of those. They're known for being really good schools. What made them so special back then?
Well, think about it. They weren't just schools. They were like centers for female empowerment. Many of them had women faculty, which provided important role models for these young women. And their curriculum was designed to prepare women for more than just being housewives, you know? They offered serious courses in science, math, literature, the arts.
So they were really challenging the traditional gender role.
Exactly. And a lot of graduates from these women's colleges went on to become leaders in the women's rights movement.
That makes sense. But did these schools face any pushback? I mean, given the social climate at the time?
Oh, for sure. Lots of people, especially traditionalists, thought women should stay home, not go to college. But those women's colleges, they thrived despite the opposition. It shows how strong the demand for women's education was.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see those women breaking down barriers. You know, it's amazing when you think about it. Immigration, urbanization, all those new technologies, the social changes, it's like everything was happening at once back then.
It really was a whirlwind of change, all these different forces shaping the American city. And when we look at mass communication, we see how interconnected everything truly was.
Yeah, my notes point to daily newspapers as a major force in this communication revolution. What made them so powerful?
Well, technology played a huge role. The telegraph, for example, meant that news could travel incredibly fast. Suddenly, people were learning about events happening far away, almost in real time.
It's hard to imagine not having instant news these days.
It was a totally different world. And this rapid flow of information, it helped create these powerful newspaper publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer.
Those names sound familiar. Weren't they the guys behind all those sensationalized headlines and stories?
Yeah, that's them. They were competing fiercely for readers, often resorting to what we now call yellow journalism.
The early days of clickbait. But was that kind of sensationalism bad for journalism?
It's a tough question. On one hand, yellow journalism could be pretty irresponsible, you know, exaggerating or even fabricating stories just to sell papers.
Not exactly ethical.
Right. But on the other hand, these newspapers also played a role in exposing corruption and raising awareness about important social issues. They had a real impact on public opinion and politics.
So, a mixed bag, I guess. A powerful tool that could be used for good or bad.
Exactly. Speaking of powerful tools, we can't forget about Alexander Graham Bell and his invention, the telephone.
The telephone.
Yeah.
Another game changer, right? Connecting people across Vast distances. It must have seemed like magic back then.
It was transformative. Think about the impact on families, businesses. Suddenly, distance didn't matter as much. And then the switchboard was invented in 1878, which allowed for the creation of these telephone networks. It made communication even easier.
I read that this new technology also created job opportunities for women, right? Like telephone operator.
That's right. Most telephone operators were women. They played a vital role in connecting calls. It was a demanding job, needing patience and a good demeanor.
Makes sense. So technology wasn't just changing communication, it was reshaping social roles too.
It was a time of constant change and innovation affecting every part of city life. We've covered so much: immigration, technology, entertainment, medicine, education. What stands out most to you from all this?
It's hard to choose just one thing. I'm just struck by how dynamic this whole era was.
Yeah.
So much creativity and ingenuity, constantly pushing boundaries, but also such stark contrasts, like extreme wealth next to crushing poverty, groundbreaking discoveries alongside deep-seated prejudice. It's almost overwhelming to think about.
Yeah, it was a real crucible. You had these forces of progress and inequality clashing all the time. And in the end, they shaped the modern American city.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up. A huge thank you to you, our expert, for taking us on this amazing journey. And to all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring history.